Staff Sergeant Tommy "Thunder" Morrison had brought his crew through North Africa and Italy without losing a single man. But on October 15, 1944, when their Sherman tank Steel Thunder threw a track in the middle of Nazi-held territory, their greatest test wasn't against the enemy, it was against time itself. Welcome to Vaulted Secret Stories. Before we begin this incredible tale of brotherhood, sacrifice, and the moment when 5 ordinary Americans chose courage over survival, tell me in the comments, what does loyalty mean to you when everything is on the line? And if you believe stories of heroism and brotherhood deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. This is the story of 5 men who turned a broken tank into a fortress and held the line when retreat was the only logical choice. October 15, 1944, the autumn mist hung heavy over the Belgian countryside as the M4 Sherman tank Steel Thunder rumbled down a muddy forest road. Inside the 33-ton steel beast, 5 American soldiers had been living, fighting, and bleeding together for 18 months across 2 continents. Staff Sergeant Tommy "Thunder" Morrison commanded from the turret, his weathered face scanning the tree line through binoculars. At 29, Morrison was ancient by tank commander standards, a career soldier who had enlisted in 1939 and learned his trade in the crucible of desert warfare. His crew called him Thunder because when he spoke, people listened, and when he gave orders, mountains moved. Morrison wore his authority like a comfortable old coat, never raising his voice because he never needed to. 3 years of combat had taught him that respect was earned through competence, not rank. He knew every rivet on their Sherman, every strength and weakness of his crew, and exactly how much punishment Steel Thunder could take before she broke. In the gunner's seat below, Corporal Jake Deadeye Sullivan peered through his telescopic sight, searching for targets that hopefully weren't there. Sullivan was 26, a former auto mechanic from Detroit, who had discovered he possessed an almost supernatural ability to put shells exactly where they needed to go. He could thread a 75mm round through a church window at 800 yards. But what made him invaluable wasn't just his accuracy, it was his calm. While other gunners got excited during fights, Sullivan became increasingly methodical, calculating angles and distances with the precision of an accountant. He had once destroyed 3 German anti-tank guns in 4 minutes, and when asked about it afterward, simply said he'd been having a good day at the office. Sergeant Mike "Lucky" O'Malley served as their loader, though his nickname was increasingly ironic. The 24-year-old from Boston had earned his moniker during their first month in North Africa when a German shell had penetrated their previous tank's armor, killing everyone except O'Malley, who had been thrown clear by the explosion. Since then, he'd survived situations that should have killed him 6 times over. O'Malley was faster than any loader Morrison had ever seen. He could keep their main gun firing at maximum rate, even under the most intense pressure. But more importantly, he was the crew's heart, the one who kept morale up during the dark moments with his endless supply of jokes, stories, and completely fabricated tales of his romantic conquests. Private First Class Carlos "Wheels" Ramirez drove Steel Thunder with the delicate touch of a pianist and the reflexes of a fighter pilot. The 22-year-old from New Mexico had been behind the wheel since Sicily, and he knew every quirk, vibration, and mechanical personality trait of their Sherman. Ramirez could thread the tank through spaces that seemed impossibly narrow, reversed at full speed while under fire, and somehow always found the one good route through impossible terrain. The 5th member of their brotherhood was Private Danny Kid Patterson, their assistant driver and bow gunner. At 19, Patterson was the youngest and newest member of the crew, having joined them 4 months ago after their previous bow gunner had been wounded during the breakout from Normandy. Patterson was small-town Iowa, earnest and hardworking, with the kind of wholesome face that belonged on recruiting posters. The 5th member of their brotherhood was Private Danny Kid Patterson, their assistant driver and bow gunner. At 19, Patterson was the youngest and newest member of the crew, having joined them 4 months ago after their previous bow gunner had been wounded during the breakout from Normandy. Patterson was small-town Iowa, earnest and hardworking, with the kind of wholesome face that belonged on recruiting posters. Their Sherman bore the scars of 18 months of warfare, bullet holes that had been patched and repainted, weld marks where armor had been reinforced, and the accumulated wear of a machine that had been pushed far beyond its design limits. The number 203 was painted in white on her turret, along with the name Steel Thunder, in bold letters across the gun barrel. On this particular October morning, they were part of a reconnaissance force pushing ahead of the main Allied advance, probing German defenses. Their orders were simple: advance 5 miles east, secure a crossroads that intelligence believed was lightly defended, and hold it until relieving forces arrived. It was the kind of mission they had executed dozens of times before, dangerous but straightforward, requiring skill, courage, and the tight coordination that had kept them alive through 18 months of warfare. Intelligence says we're looking at maybe a squad of infantry and possibly 1 anti-tank gun, Morrison had told them during their morning briefing. Trust it about as far as you can throw a tank. O'Malley had finished with a grin. Exactly. So we go in ready for anything, we stick to the plan, and we watch each other's backs. They climbed into Steel Thunder that morning with the casual professionalism of men who had done this job so many times it had become routine. But routine was about to become anything but. As they approached their objective, Ramirez noticed the first sign of trouble. "Thunder, we've got track problems," he reported over the intercom. "Feels like we're throwing the right track." Morrison felt his stomach tighten. Track problems in enemy territory were every tank commander's nightmare. Without tracks, their 33-ton Sherman became a stationary target, vulnerable to any German with an anti-tank weapon. "How bad?" Morrison asked. "Getting worse every yard," Ramirez replied. "I could nurse her maybe another half-mile, but after that, ... Morrison made his decision with the cold calculation that had kept them alive for 18 months. "Find us a defensive position. Somewhere we can cover the crossroads even if we can't move." The track finally gave way 300 yards short of the crossroads. With a metallic snap that echoed through the forest like a gunshot, Ramirez managed to guide their crippled tank into a small clearing that offered good fields of fire toward the road junction. But there was no hiding the fact that they were now stuck. Morrison surveyed their position through his commander's periscope. They had decent cover from the tree line and good visibility toward the crossroads. If they had to make a stand, this wasn't the worst place to do it. But they were also completely isolated, with no way to retreat and no hope of reinforcement for at least 6 hours. "All right, listen up," Morrison said over the intercom. "We've got a choice to make. We can abandon Steel Thunder and try to make it back to our lines on foot, or we can stay and hold this position until help arrives." The response was immediate and unanimous. "Where you go, we go, Thunder," O'Malley said. "I ain't leaving my tank," Ramirez added. "We've got plenty of ammunition," Sullivan observed practically. "I'm with you, Sergeant," Patterson said quietly. Morrison felt a surge of pride in his crew. They were scared. Any sane person would be scared, but they were staying. They were choosing duty over safety, brotherhood over survival. "All right then," Morrison said. "Let's turn Steel Thunder into a fortress." For the next hour, the crew of Steel Thunder worked with efficient desperation. Morrison organized their defense while his crew turned their disabled tank into the most dangerous stationary weapon in the Belgian forest. O'Malley inventoried their ammunition: 42 rounds of 75mm high explosive, 18 armor-piercing shells, and over 3,000 rounds for their .30 caliber machine guns. It was enough firepower to hold off a significant force, but only if they used it wisely. Sullivan adjusted his gun sight and ranged potential targets, marking distances to key terrain features. The crossroads was exactly 400 yards away, well within effective range for their main gun. The approach roads were covered by their machine guns. Ramirez performed emergency maintenance on their engine and electrical systems, ensuring that Steel Thunder could keep fighting even if she couldn't move. He also rigged an improvised repair for their radio, boosting their transmission power. Patterson distributed personal ammunition and positioned their small arms where they could be quickly accessed. Each crew member carried an M1 Garand rifle and a .45 caliber pistol. But in a defensive fight, their personal weapons would be secondary to the tank's main armament. Morrison studied the terrain and developed contingency plans for different types of attacks. He identified likely enemy approach routes, planned ammunition usage to maximize their defensive capability, and prepared fallback positions within Steel Thunder's armored hull. But mostly, they waited. Waiting was perhaps the hardest part of combat, the time when imagination could run wild and fear could take hold. Morrison had learned over 3 years of warfare that the key to maintaining morale during these periods was to keep his crew focused on tasks and talking about anything except the danger they faced. "O'Malley," Morrison said, "tell us again about that girl in Naples." "Which one?" O'Malley replied with a grin. "I was very popular in Naples. The one who supposedly fell in love with your Boston accent." "That wasn't supposedly, Thunder. That was genuine attraction to my sophisticated urban charm." The banter continued, each crew member contributing stories and jokes that had been told and retold dozens of times. They talked about home, about plans for after the war, about anything except the fact that they might not live to see another sunset. At 11:43 hours, Morrison's instincts proved correct when movement appeared on the North Road. "Movement on the North Road," Sullivan reported, his eye pressed to the gun sight. "Looks like a motorcycle with a sidecar." Morrison swiveled his binoculars toward the indicated direction. A single German motorcycle was approaching the crossroads, moving slowly and carefully. The rider and passenger were clearly reconnaissance troops, scouting ahead of a larger force. The motorcycle stopped at the crossroads, just 400 yards away. Morrison could see the 2 German soldiers clearly through his binoculars, young men probably not much older than Patterson, doing their job with the same professional competence that he demanded from his own crew. One of the Germans dismounted and began examining the road junction, clearly looking for signs of Allied activity. The other remained on the motorcycle, scanning the surrounding forest with binoculars. For 5 minutes that felt like hours, the German reconnaissance team examined the crossroads area. Finally, they remounted their motorcycle and prepared to leave. That's when the German with the binoculars took one final scan of the forest and his gaze stopped directly on Steel Thunder's position. Morrison saw the exact moment when the enemy soldiers spotted their camouflaged tank, saw the recognition dawn in the man's eyes, saw him grab his companion's shoulder and point directly at their hiding place. "They've made us," Morrison said calmly into the intercom. "Sullivan, take them." The 75mm gun spoke with authority, sending a high-explosive shell across 400 yards of Belgian forest in less than 2 seconds. The explosion obliterated the motorcycle and both riders, but it also announced to every German within 5 miles that Steel Thunder was there, armed, and ready to fight. "Contact report sent," Ramirez said, confirming that he had managed to radio their situation to headquarters. "Help's coming, but it'll be at least 6 hours." 6 hours. Morrison absorbed this information with the calm that had kept him alive through dozens of similar situations. 6 hours was a very long time to hold a fixed position against an unknown enemy force, but it wasn't impossible. "All right, gentlemen," Morrison said. "Now we find out what we're really made of." The German response was swift and professional. Within 20 minutes of Steel Thunder's opening shot, enemy infantry began appearing at the edge of the forest, moving in small groups and using cover with the skill of experienced troops. Morrison studied them through his periscope, counting numbers and identifying equipment. What he saw made his stomach tighten. These weren't tired, demoralized conscripts. These were Waffen-SS troops, elite soldiers with excellent equipment and fanatical motivation. At 12:05 hours, the Germans opened fire. The first indication was the distinctive crack of a Panzerfaust, a German anti-tank rocket launching from the tree line. Morrison had just enough time to shout "incoming" before the warhead slammed into Steel Thunder's frontal armor with a tremendous crash. The shape-charged warhead penetrated the outer layer of armor but failed to punch completely through, sending fragments ricocheting around the interior. Patterson cried out as metal splinters tore across his left arm, but he remained at his position and continued operating his machine gun. The Panzerfaust attack was followed immediately by intensive small arms fire from at least 20 positions. Bullets hammered against Steel Thunder's armor like deadly hail, filling the forest with a continuous crackling roar. Morrison forced himself to remain calm and analyze the tactical situation. The Germans were using suppressive fire to keep Steel Thunder's crew buttoned up while other troops maneuvered into assault positions. "Sullivan, do you have targets?" Muzzle flashes from the tree line, but they're spread out. Hard to get multiple kills with one round. "Pick the biggest concentration and fire for effect." The 75mm gun roared, sending a high-explosive shell into a cluster of pine trees where Morrison had seen muzzle flashes. The explosion shattered timber and sent fragments scything through the forest, temporarily silencing several enemy positions. The battle settled into a deadly rhythm. German infantry would advance using fire and movement tactics, attempting to get close enough to use their Panzerfausts effectively. Steel Thunder's crew would engage them with machine gun fire and occasional main gun rounds, forcing the attackers to take cover and restart their approach. For 30 minutes, the pattern continued. The Germans were skilled and determined, but they were also facing a crew that had been fighting together for 18 months and had developed almost supernatural coordination. But ammunition was finite, and the German force was larger than Morrison had initially estimated. By 12:40 hours, he could see that they were facing at least 60 infantry, with more arriving continuously. That's when the Germans brought up their heavy weapons. Morrison first noticed the new threat when a massive explosion erupted 50 yards to their left. The blast was far too large for a Panzerfaust. It had to be artillery or a heavy anti-tank gun. "Packed gun," Sullivan shouted, identifying the threat. Northeast, about 800 yards. Morrison spotted the German anti-tank gun, a 75mm Pak-40 bit, that had been manhandled into position and camouflaged with pine branches. It was exactly the kind of weapon that could penetrate Steel Thunder's armor at range. "Sullivan, priority target. Take out that gun." The duel between Steel Thunder and the Pak gun lasted exactly 90 seconds. Sullivan's first round landed short. The enemy crew got off their second shot, which screamed past Steel Thunder's turret with inches to spare. Sullivan adjusted his aim and fired again, this time scoring a direct hit that obliterated the anti-tank gun and its crew in a tremendous explosion. But the Germans had more surprises. At 12:45 hours, Morrison heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the distinctive rumble of tank engines. Through his binoculars, he could see movement in the forest as German armor approached their position. "Tank contact," Morrison reported. "Panzer, for maybe 2 of them, moving up from the south." The first Panzer IV emerged from the tree line at 600 yards, its long-barreled 75mm gun traversing towards Steel Thunder's position. "Range 600, Sullivan reported. "I have a clear shot. Take him." Steel Thunder's main gun spoke with authority, sending an armor-piercing shell across the battlefield. The round struck the Panzer, the fourth's turret, penetrating the armor and detonating inside the fighting compartment. The German tank erupted in flames as its ammunition exploded, but the second Panzer IV was already moving, using cover and concealment to minimize exposure while closing the range. At 400 yards, the surviving Panzer IV fired its first shot. The round struck Steel Thunder's frontal slope and ricocheted upward, ringing the interior like a bell but failing to penetrate. Sullivan was traversing to engage the new threat when disaster struck. A Panzerfaust fired from close range by German infantry struck Steel Thunder's right track assembly. The warhead didn't penetrate the main armor, but it damaged the track mechanism and jammed their turret traverse. "Turret's stuck," Sullivan reported. "I can't traverse to engage the Panzer." Morrison felt time slow as he absorbed this information. They were immobilized. Their main gun was pointed in the wrong direction, and a German tank was maneuvering for a killing shot. "Ramirez, can you pivot the hull?" "Negative. Track damage is too severe." The Panzer IV was moving into position for a flank shot that would certainly penetrate Steel Thunder's thinner side armor. Morrison had perhaps 30 seconds before his crew was killed. That's when O'Malley proved why he was called lucky. The loader had been working on the jammed turret mechanism, while Morrison and Sullivan were analyzing their tactical situation. Using mechanical knowledge and desperation-fueled strength, he managed to free the traverse motor just as the German tank was lining up its killing shot. "Turrets free," O'Malley shouted. Sullivan spun the gun around with the speed of a man whose life depended on precision. He had one shot before the Panzer IV could fire. The armor-piercing round took the German tank in the side at 300 yards, punching through the steel plate and into the crew compartment. The Panzer IV shuddered, stopped, and began burning. By 1300 hours, the situation had become desperate. Steel Thunder had been under continuous attack for over an hour, and German forces were pressing closer from all directions. Morrison estimated they were now facing at least 80 infantry, with more arriving continuously. Ammunition was becoming critical. They had fired 18 main gun rounds and nearly 1,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition. O'Malley's careful inventory showed they had enough for perhaps another hour of intensive combat. More troubling was the accumulating damage to their tank. 3 Panzerfaust hits had damaged external equipment and caused minor armor penetration. Their radio antenna had been shot away, cutting them off from communication with friendly forces. Most seriously, Patterson had been wounded again when fragments from a close-range explosion had penetrated the bowgunner's position. The 19-year-old was still fighting, but Morrison could see that he was weakening from blood loss. At 13:15 hours, the Germans tried a new approach using smoke grenades to conceal a major assault, bringing their entire force forward simultaneously in an attempt to overrun Steel Thunder's position through sheer numbers. Smoke screen developing on all sides, Morrison reported to his crew. "This is going to be the big push. Conserve ammunition and make every shot count." The assault reached its climax when German troops broke through the smoke screen at 3 different points simultaneously. Morrison found himself facing close-quarters battle, infantry within Panzerfaust range, moving too fast for the main gun to engage effectively. That's when the crew of Steel Thunder demonstrated why they had survived 18 months of combat together. O'Malley abandoned his position as loader and grabbed his M1 Garand, firing through the commander's hatch at German troops attempting to climb onto the tank. Ramirez kept his machine gun firing in controlled bursts. Patterson, despite his wounds, maintained steady fire from the bow gun position. Sullivan traversed the main gun with desperate precision, firing high-explosive rounds into concentrations of enemy troops at point-blank range. Morrison coordinated the defense while engaging individual targets with his submachine gun. For 10 minutes that felt like hours, the battle raged at knife-fighting range. German troops reached Steel Thunder's hull and attempted to place explosive charges, only to be driven off by defensive fire. But the crew's coordination and fighting spirit proved superior to the enemy's numbers. The German assault broke apart under Steel Thunder's concentrated defensive fire, leaving dozens of casualties scattered around the tank's position. As the smoke cleared, Morrison surveyed the battlefield through his periscope. Bodies lay everywhere. German soldiers who had gotten closer to overrunning an American position than any enemy troops had managed in 18 months of warfare. But the victory had come at a cost. Steel Thunder had suffered additional damage during the close-quarters fighting. Their main gun's recoil mechanism had been damaged, limiting their rate of fire. Most critically, they were down to their last few rounds of main gun ammunition. Morrison checked his watch. 13:30 hours. They had been fighting for nearly 2 hours, and help wouldn't arrive for at least 4 more hours. That's when Morrison made the decision that would define the rest of his life. "Listen up," Morrison said over the intercom. "I'm going to give you the situation straight. We're low on ammunition, we're taking damage faster than we can absorb it, and the Germans are going to keep coming until they overwhelm us or help arise." He paused, letting his crew absorb this information. "I could order you to abandon Steel Thunder and try to make it back to our lines on foot. We might have a chance if we moved now, before they completely surround us." But O'Malley prompted, "But if we leave, the Germans will have a clear route to attack our advancing forces from behind. Intelligence says there's at least a battalion moving through this area. If they hit our guys from the rear while they're engaged with other enemy forces..." Morrison didn't need to finish the sentence. Every member of his crew understood the tactical situation. "So what are you saying, Thunder?" Sullivan asked. "I'm saying we stay. We hold this ground until relieving forces arrive, no matter what it costs." The intercom was quiet for several seconds. Morrison could hear his crew breathing. could sense them processing the implications of his decision. "I'm with you, Sergeant," Patterson said quietly. "Where you go, we go," O'Malley added. "I didn't come this far to quit," Ramirez said. "Let's finish what we started," Sullivan concluded. Morrison felt a mixture of pride and sorrow wash over him. These 4 men were choosing certain death out of loyalty to him, to each other, and to the mission they had been given. "All right then," Morrison said. "Let's make our stand count." The second German assault began at 13:45 hours with a concentrated mortar barrage. At 13:52 hours, the artillery stopped and German troops emerged from concealment at 6 different positions simultaneously. Morrison counted at least 60 infantry advancing in a coordinated assault. "Here they come," Morrison said calmly. "Make it count." Sullivan opened fire with their remaining main gun ammunition, carefully selecting targets that offered the maximum number of casualties per round. Each high-explosive shell was precisely aimed at concentrations of advancing infantry, but Steel Thunder's ammunition was nearly exhausted. After firing their last 75mm round, the crew was reduced to machine guns and personal weapons against 60 determined enemy soldiers. German troops reached the tank's hull and began attempting to force entry through hatches and vision ports. Hand grenades exploded against Steel Thunder's armor as enemy soldiers tried to destroy external equipment. At 14:10 hours, disaster struck. A Panzerschreck round, fired at point-blank range, penetrated Steel Thunder's side armor and exploded inside the fighting compartment. The blast killed O'Malley instantly and severely wounded Ramirez. Morrison felt the tank shudder as fragments tore through the interior. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear Ramirez screaming. "Report," Morrison shouted over the intercom. "O'Malley's gone," Sullivan reported with mechanical calm. "Ramirez is hit bad. Patterson's unconscious but breathing." Morrison absorbed this information with numb detachment. Half his crew was dead or dying, their tank was crippled, and German troops were preparing for a final assault. But they were still alive, still fighting, and still holding the crossroads. Outside Steel Thunder, Morrison could hear German voices as enemy troops regrouped for their final assault. The enemy commander had committed everything to destroying the lone American tank. That's when they heard the sound that would save their lives. From the west, barely audible over the noise of battle, came the distinctive rumble of multiple tank engines. Morrison grabbed his binoculars and scanned the tree line. Through the smoke and haze, he spotted them. 3 Sherman tanks advancing through the forest with infantry support, American markings clearly visible on their hulls. The relief force had arrived 2 hours early, drawn by the sound of battle. The German assault collapsed as enemy troops found themselves caught between Steel Thunder's defensive fire and the advancing American force. Within minutes, the forest was filled with fleeing German soldiers. Morrison keyed his radio, hoping the damaged equipment would transmit one final message. "This is Steel Thunder. Position secure. We need medical evacuation for wounded crew members." The response came through static and interference. "Roger, Steel Thunder, medical team, en route." Outstanding job holding that position. 3 weeks later, Staff Sergeant Tommy Morrison sat beside hospital beds in a field hospital in Belgium, watching his crew recover from their wounds. Patterson had required surgery, but was expected to make a full recovery. Ramirez had lost significant blood and would need months of rehabilitation, but he was alive. Sullivan had suffered a concussion but was already asking when they could return to their tank. Morrison had been recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. Patterson, Sullivan, and Ramirez had been put in for Bronze Stars with V devices for valor. O'Malley would receive his Bronze Star posthumously, along with a Purple Heart that would be sent to his parents in Boston. The official after-action report credited Steel Thunder's crew with destroying 2 German tanks, 1 anti-tank gun, and an estimated 40 enemy infantry while holding a strategic position against overwhelming odds. "You know what O'Malley would say if he was here?" Patterson asked from his hospital bed. "What's that, kid?" Morrison replied. "He'd say we should have charged them," said defensive fighting was for people without imagination. Morrison felt tears forming in his eyes as he listened to his crew remembered their fallen comrade. O'Malley had been the heart of their brotherhood, the one who kept morale up during the darkest moments. 6 months later, when Patterson, Sullivan, and Ramirez had recovered and been cleared for combat duty, they returned to Steel Thunder together. A new loader had been assigned, a young soldier from Chicago who understood that he was joining not just a tank crew, but a family. They painted a new name on Steel Thunder's gun barrel, Lucky's Thunder, in honor of the crew member who couldn't come home with them but would never be forgotten. The war ended 4 months later with Germany's surrender. But the brotherhood forged in the Belgian forest would last the rest of their lives. Morrison, Sullivan, Patterson, and Ramirez stayed in touch for decades, gathering every year on October 15th to remember the battle that had tested their courage and proven their loyalty to each other. At each reunion, they would tell stories about O'Malley, sharing memories of the man who had been the heart of their crew, and whose sacrifice had helped them understand that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are impossible. Steel Thunder was eventually retired to a military museum, where a plaque tells the story of 5 American soldiers who held a crossroads, against overwhelming odds, and chose brotherhood over survival. But the real memorial to their courage isn't made of steel and armor plate. It's the bond between four men who learned that the greatest victories aren't measured in territory captured or enemies destroyed, but in the willingness to stand beside your brothers when everything else falls away. On October 15, 1944, 5 American tank crew members proved that brotherhood isn't just about living together, it's about being willing to die together for something larger than yourself. Welcome to Vaulted Secret Stories, where we remember that the greatest heroes aren't the ones who never felt fear. They're the ones who felt fear and stayed anyway.